So happy today to have the final guest speaker for our 5-week speaker series. Such a wide variety of guests that we've had join us throughout these 5 weeks. It just really has been a wonderful experience. So thank you. And I'm very excited that Ken Morris is here to join us. I want to tell you a little bit about the origin of this speaker series. This is a bit of a repeat for those who have joined us before, but I think we have enough newbies today that I'd like to repeat it. I do want to tell everybody that this is being recorded and can be watched later. All 5 weeks are available on Villa Gardens website. You can always find me. I'm not going to give you instructions to that now, but it's easy enough and they're all available if you want to see them. My name is Donnie Lawrence. I'm the marketing director here at Villa Gardens. And we have, in the fall of 2018, Villa Gardens resident Nan Johnson wanted to make sure that every American and non-American, everybody in the world celebrated the Centennial, the passing of the 19th Amendment in August of 2020. So she gathered a small group of women in Pasadena at that time, and the idea of celebrating on January 1st with a float in the Rose Parade was born. Maybe you saw that float. It was called Years of Hope, Years of Courage, had Lady Liberty standing, I'm not going to remember how many feet, some of the people on these call will, but it was huge and beautiful. There were 100 men and women walking behind that float in suffrage attire and some of you are on this call. And then there were 18, I want to say celebrities to me, on that float. Ken Morris, our speaker, was one of those. It was quite a way to start the year, and we're thrilled that we could do that. As the actual day approached for the 100th anniversary, we decided that it was important at Villa Gardens to celebrate this month as well with our speaker series. So we gathered another small group of people from Pasadena, and we are calling this group 2020 Plus. And this speaker series is the launch to that. Nan Johnson, the inspiration for all of this celebration, spent much of her life in Rochester, New York, the home of the suffrage movement. She served in the legislature in Monroe County for 20 years and taught at the University of Rochester, was the founding director of the Susan B. Anthony Center at the University of Rochester. She also had close civic ties to the Seneca Falls, the home of the National Women's Hall of Fame and the Women's Rights National Park. Many more accolades for Nan, but without further ado, I invite Nan to introduce Ken. Nan, you probably have to unmute your,
I give up. I did right away for you.
Okay.
Okay.
We hear
you now,
now.
Nan.
All right.
We hear you.
Listen, everybody, I do want to say just a few words, and I wrote them down because you know what a old sentimental thing I am, and when I get talking about all of you and what you've done, I always start to cry. So just please bear with me for a little bit. But like you, I am very honored to have the privilege and to hear
Stop the video.
From our speaker, Ken Morris, and I'm going to make this brief. Thanks to all of you for making this tribute to Pasadena 2020 and 2020 Plus fulfill the mission of honoring the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. I want to give special thanks to Donine and Catherine for guiding us through this series, and they really have done that, and I can't thank them enough. And I want to thank Jean and Carolyn for recruiting our wonderful speakers, including you, Lynn, or I saw you a little while ago. Yes, Lynn, you have wonderful speakers. And Jean and Carolyn have devoted countless time and effort to making this float a reality. And so have you, Annette, wherever you are. I can't see you at the moment. We couldn't have done it without them. And please allow me to give a shout out for all the wonderful women and men who contributed to making that float go down Colorado Avenue when it did and speak for the world. Now, Ken, I hope you will take this as a compliment when I say that you're a legend in your own time, because you are, and not only in California and New York, but around the world. And thank you for sharing some time with us. And I'll try not to cry when you speak, okay? Thank you very much, Ken. Welcome, everybody. Please welcome Ken here. We are honored and privileged to have him here as our speaker.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nan. And Donine, thank you, and your whole team for putting this together. And I think often about that day on January 1st on the float. And I was honored to be the only man on the float amongst so many really accomplished women. And so I was very honored to represent the family of Frederick Douglass and Anna Murray Douglass. And little did we know that that would be the last Rose Parade for a little while, and uncertain future on when we're going to be able to watch the Rose Parade again. And so I didn't know it was special enough to participate in it, but to know that we're not going to have one next year, and to know that we were able to do it. And of course, the float won the award, and I was very proud just to be a part of all of that. So thank you all very much for coming. I'm excited to talk to you about my family, the Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington family. I'm excited to talk to you about the work that we do at Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. I also brought some family photographs that I want to share with you as I talk about some of my ancestors. I want you to be able to see them as well. So I'll be sharing that presentation in just a little bit. You know, I am the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass. Wow. And I'm also the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. And that's a whole lot of greats. And every time I tell people what my relationship is to my ancestors, not only is it a mouthful trying to say all of those greats, but it sometimes makes me feel very far removed. And you might be sitting there having a hard time trying to imagine what my connection is to Douglass and to Washington. It's like trying to picture what $1 billion looks like with so many zeros. But many people knew or know a grandparent. And some of you may have even known a great-grandparent. And that's how close I feel to both of my ancestors, because you see, my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 103 years old, and she met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl. She didn't know that she was going to grow up and marry his grandson one day, but that's what happened. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, she lived to be 95, and she was Booker T. Washington's daughter. And I remember being a little boy and sitting on my great-grandmother Fanny Douglass's lap as she would tell me what it was like to know, as she would call him, the man with the great big white hair. And I remember sitting at the knee of my Aunt Portia, and she would give me firsthand stories about her father, Booker T. Washington. And several years ago, I was with a group of students. They were 5th and 6th graders, and they were all looking at me kind of cross-eyed, like, man, you were so far removed. And what does all of this history have to do with my life today? And why are you talking about these people that lived so long ago? And so I was trying to give them some context to how close I am in the generations. And I had this thought that I think was pretty profound, that hands that touched the great Frederick Douglass and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington also touched mine. So in a sense, even with all of those greats, I can say I stand one person away from each man, I stand one person away from history, and I stand one person away from slavery. We're not that far removed from the history of slavery in this country when you consider the generations. And while we commemorated the 150th anniversary of the ratification of the 13th Amendment a few years ago, when you consider the generations of families, we're not that far removed. Both Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington were born into slavery. They were born into the most horrific conditions that a human being could be subjected to, but yet through the power of education. Now, we know from our US history, it was illegal to teach enslaved people to read and write. So both of my ancestors would have to steal their education. And in fact, Frederick Douglass never spent one day of his life in a classroom. He had no formal education. And people would see him later in life as this great big white-haired statesman who was the first African-American nominated for Vice President of the United States, first African-American US Marshal, first African-American ambassador and consul general to Haiti, first African-American recorder of deeds in the District of Columbia, and the first African-American to have a statue dedicated in his honor. And the list goes on and on and on. And people would say, Frederick, you're so accomplished. I need to know, where did you go to school? Where did you get your education? And he would respond on occasion by saying, my degree is written on my back. My degree is written on my back. He spent the first 20 years of his life enslaved. And so I'll be talking about his story. I'm going to talk about Booker T. Washington. I'm going to focus a little bit more on Frederick Douglass in this presentation because of his connection to women's rights. And as we've heard, we are commemorating and celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, women's rights and women's suffrage. So I'm going to talk about that. And I'm also going to talk about my great-great-great-grandmother, Anna Murray Douglass. And you're probably not familiar with her story, but I want you to know that she is a big part of all of this because there would be no Frederick Douglass without Anna Murray Douglass in his life. But before I jump into that, let me go ahead and share my screen because I get a couple of questions when people meet me for the first time. It happens inevitably. The first question that I'll get is, so you're related to Frederick Douglass and to Booker T. Washington? Well, what do you do? And they always follow that up with, and it better be good. So there, as you can imagine, there has been this kind of weight of expectation that I've carried most of my life to try and live up to these iconic heroes. And there have been times that I've felt like I've been in a long, vast shadow, and it's been very hard to step out of that shadow. So I'll talk about that. And then the other question that I get is, how is it that Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, how did the families come together? Because I know that they're not related to each other. So here's how it happened. It happened on my mother's side of the family. And in this photograph, you see my grandmother, Nettie Hancock Washington, looking like a movie star. She was beautiful and well-dressed all the time. And on the left of the screen is my grandfather, Frederick Douglass III. So my grandmother and my grandfather met in 1941 at Tuskegee Normal School and Institute, which is a school that Booker T. Washington founded in 1881. They happened to be on campus the same day. They were rushing across to get to the other side and literally bumped into each other, didn't know that the other descended from an historic family, and they fell in love at first sight and wound up getting married just 3 months later. So it was a true love story, and perhaps it was meant to be that the two families would come together. When my mom was born, Nettie Washington Douglass is her name, and she lives in Atlanta. She's also the chair of our organization, the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. When my mom was born, she was the first person to unite the bloodlines of these historic families. My mom was an only child, so when I was born, I was the first male to carry the dual lineage. Also in this photograph on the right of the screen is my grandmother's brother, Booker T. Washington III. So the significance of this photo is you have Booker T. Washington III shaking hands with Frederick Douglass III, and then thus the families are officially united. Now there's Frederick with his great big white hair. In that photograph is my great-grandfather, Joseph. That's Frederick Douglass's grandson. Frederick had 21 grandchildren, and this is the only grandchild that he was ever photographed with. And so we like to say in my family that he was the favorite grandchild. But they had the violin in common. We know that Frederick Douglass taught himself to read and write, but he also taught himself to play the violin. And he taught Joseph how to play the violin, and he became a concert violinist. He played in the White House on several occasions, and he was the first Black classical recording artist for the Victor Talking Machine Company. So Frederick was also a great teacher of the violin and loved music. Now, what I'm doing with this series of photos is I'm showing you how close I am to Frederick Douglass just through 3 images. In this photo, you see Joseph as an older man, my great-grandmother Fanny sitting, she's the one that lived to be 103 years old, and on her lap is my grandfather Frederick Douglass III, and then his sister Blanche. Now, I love showing this photograph to students, and I'll ask them, is there anybody familiar in that photo? And they'll say, yeah, you're in it. And then I'll ask them, well, which one am I? And half of them will say, I'm the smaller one, the younger one. And the other half will say, I'm the older one. And then some people will make comments like, oh yeah, that's Michael Jackson. But I am the older one with the afro. And there I am with my great-grandmother Fanny, who in that picture was probably about a little over 100 years old, and just really, really loved my great-grandmother. So Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He was born on the eastern shore of Maryland to an enslaved woman and to a white man, and it was presumed that his master was his father. He never had a pair of pants or shoes until he was about 6 or 7 years old. He would sleep head first in an old corn sack with his feet hanging out on cold winter nights because that was the only way he could try and keep himself warm. He only saw his mother 4 times his whole life, and that's because she lived on a plantation that was 12 miles away. So in order for her to see her son, she would have to work in the fields picking cotton from sunup to sundown, and then walk 12 miles in the middle of the night, and she would spend just a few precious moments with him until he would fall asleep. He was about a year old when he was taken from his mother. She would spend that time with him, and then she would walk 12 miles back so she could be back on the plantation by the time the sun came up, because if she wasn't, she was most likely going to face some sort of punishment. Now, he did have someone early in his life that showed him some love and nurturing and care, and that was his grandmother, Betsy. Now, her job on the plantation was to raise the children until they were old enough to really begin their life in manual labor. And on this plantation, that was around 5 or 6 years old. And you'll notice that when I talk about Frederick's age, I use an age range, and that's because he didn't know when he was born. He didn't know when his birthday was. As he got older, he kind of made an estimate that he was probably born somewhere in 1817, but after he passed away, it was determined through some documentation that was found from his old master that he was born in 1818. So he didn't know how old he was, but when he was about 5 or 6 years old, his grandmother said, Frederick, we're going to go on a long journey. And that journey was a 20-mile walk to the main plantation, which was called the Y House, where his grandmother had done this many, many times before with the other children, but this was the first time that she was walking her own flesh and blood into slavery, her own kin. And I imagine that walk took a long time. He's clinging to her skirt. She's carrying him much of the way when his legs wouldn't carry himself. And they would finally make that last mile walk from the street up the driveway. And then Frederick sees this house bigger than anything that he's ever seen before. And he wanders off to look for something to eat and also just to check out his surroundings. And when he turned back to look for his grandmother, she was gone. So here was a boy that didn't know who his father was, only saw his mother 4 times. Now his grandmother's gone. He had 5 brothers and sisters that were like strangers to him. He had been separated from his siblings. He didn't know them. So you had this little boy who had no family, he had no home, and he had no country. But yet, in spite of all of that, he was able to rise up and to go on to affect positive change in the world around him and to affect positive change for all of us. And I'll be talking about that in more detail in a little bit. Now, in his first autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, which was published in 1845, he wrote that there was something that happened in his life that he described as divine providence in his favor. And that was he was chosen from among all of the children on the plantation to go to Baltimore to be the house servant for his master's family. Now, the importance of this move was he was leaving in an environment where he wasn't around people that he could learn to read and write from. Now he was going to the big city in Baltimore, where he would be around free Black children and he would be around poor white children. But what happened most importantly when he got there was his slave mistress, Sophia Auld, had never had a slave before. She didn't know that it was illegal to teach him to read and write. And she had a young son that she was teaching. And right alongside her son was Frederick, who was eager and bright-eyed and ready to learn. And so just out of the kindness of her Christian heart, she began to teach young Frederick his ABCs. And that's all he needed, was that little spark of light into his mental darkness, into his mental bondage. And the lessons would continue for a little while until his master found out about them. And when his master found out, he got angry and he forbade the teachings. And he looked at his wife and he looked at Frederick and he said, "You cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave." Now, I hope you all heard that message. I'll say it again. You cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave. And Frederick looked at his master and he thought, if you don't want me to have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to gain it. And he understood right then and there that knowledge is power. And that's a message that we hear today, that we talk to young people about all the time. And the other message was education equals freedom. Education equals liberation. Education equals emancipation. And so Frederick Douglass would teach himself to read and write. And he was very clever in the way that he went about doing that. He would pick up a stick, and now remember, he's interacting with the kids in the neighborhood, and he would trick them, and he would say, is this how you write an S? He'd scratch it into the dirt, and they would say, "No, Frederick, this is how you write an S." And then he would trade bread for reading lessons. He also wrote in that first autobiography, he said, "I was so hungry as a slave child. I always had this pit of hunger in my stomach that would never go away. And on occasion, when I would get food, the overseer would take cornmeal mush and throw it into a pig's trough, and all of the children, including Frederick, would crawl on their hands and knees as fast as they could to try to eat what little food was in there, to eat like pigs, to eat like animals, because that's what he was considered. He was property. He did not own himself. He was no better than the cattle, the sheep, the horses." And so now if you think about this little boy that wanted this knowledge so much that he would trade something of such great importance and value, food, he traded bread for reading lessons. And the students that I come into contact with, they always get it right away. And they'll say, "So Mr. Morris, so what you're telling me, let me see if I can understand this, is that Frederick would rather feed his mind and have his stomach go empty." And that's exactly what he would do. So he would continue to teach himself. He would continue to become unfit to be enslaved. And at the age of 18, he would make his first attempt to run away from slavery. His plan was uncovered. He was thrown into jail for for a couple of months. And then he was taken back to Baltimore. And then on September 3rd, 1838, so the anniversary is coming up in a few days, he would disguise himself as a sailor and carry with him forged identification papers, and he would escape by train and by boat, and he would settle in, he would land in New York City. Now, I want to talk about my great-grandmother, Anna Murray Douglass, because as I said earlier, there would be no Frederick Douglass without Anna in his life. She was one of the first people to plant the seed of thought in his mind that, Frederick, you're not meant to be a slave for life. And as they're starting to think about a life together, she said, "Frederick, I don't want our children's father to be a slave." Had she not sold her personal belongings to help finance his escape, had she not sewn the sailor's disguise that he would wear, who knows if he would have ever had the courage or the wherewithal to run away from slavery. And had we not had the contributions of Frederick Douglass as the great abolitionist, we might be a very different country sitting here today. They were married for 44 years. They had 5 children together, and they had 21 grandchildren together. She was a conductor on the Underground Railroad out of their house in Rochester, New York, where she helped to ferry hundreds of freedom seekers to their freedom in Canada. And so she's a very important part of this story. And I can see now, for some reason, I don't know how her photograph got omitted from this presentation. But please, if you have an opportunity, do a Google search on Anna, learn more about her. Smithsonian Magazine published a great article a couple of years ago, and look at her photograph. That was my mistake to not place that in this presentation. So Frederick, when he lands in New York City, he sends a letter back to Anna to come join him. They get married and take on the name Frederick and Anna Johnson. And with the help of conductors on the Underground Railroad, they would make their way all the way up to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where it was suggested that Frederick go because he could get a job on the ship docks there. He had acquired a skill as a ship caulker while he was enslaved in Baltimore, and he could get work there. And so 2 weeks later, they would be in New Bedford, Massachusetts, settle down, and start to have a family together. Now, I'm proud of my ancestors for a lot of things, but I think that I'm most proud because they could have just settled while Frederick was a fugitive slave. They were in a free territory. They could have just started their lives together and that would have been it. But Frederick understood that his brethren were still toiling away in chains and he was going to work to abolish slavery. And so at the age of 22, 23, he attends an abolitionist meeting on Nantucket Island. And he was in the audience when William Lloyd Garrison, the white abolitionists, and the Garrisonians heard that they had this fugitive slave in their midst. And they asked Frederick, will you just get up? Will you just tell the audience your story? Tell them what it was like to be enslaved. And he said, I was so nervous that first time speaking in front of a white audience that I was shaking from every limb. But what he was able to do was communicate to the American public for the first time the inhumanity of slavery in a way that nobody before him ever had. He was eloquent, he was charismatic, he was theatrical, he was funny in some of the descriptions of the characters that came into his life when he was enslaved. And what he was able to do was to push the abolitionist movement forward because the Garrisonians asked him to join the anti-slavery lecture circuit as a paid speaker. And so he would go from town to town, city to city, just telling his story. But then he started to have a problem. And that problem was people started to doubt that he had ever been enslaved. They couldn't wrap their minds around what they thought a slave looked and sounded like and what they were hearing in Frederick Douglass. And so they began to call him a fraud. And so in order to prove that he was who he claimed to be, he wrote that first autobiography, The Narrative, and in it, he named names and he named places. Well, now he had another problem, and that was it became a best-selling book. It sold 5,000 copies in the first 3 months, and that's the last thing that you want is the notoriety of a best-selling book if you're trying to hide from your master. It made him an instant celebrity and a household name, and now his master knew where he was every minute of every day. So he would flee to Europe for a couple of years as a cooling off period. And while he's traveling around Ireland and Scotland and England, and he's talking about the abolition of slavery in the United States, he landed in this place called Newcastle upon Tyne in England. And his abolitionist friends there helped to raise money to purchase his freedom from his master for $711. And he was able to come back to the United States. He had taken on the name Frederick Douglass. He and the family would settle in Rochester, New York, where he would publish the North Star newspaper, which became the leading abolitionist voice. He would become an advisor to presidents, in particular to Abraham Lincoln. And he and the abolitionists were responsible for pushing Lincoln to the point where he would finally sign the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed only those people that were enslaved in the states that were in rebellion to the Union, that had joined the Confederacy, not the states like Maryland that were the border states. So it would take the ratification of the 13th Amendment and, of course, the Civil War to bring down the institution of slavery. And then Frederick Douglass would go on to be a statesman and be the first African-American to do all of those things that I mentioned in my introduction. Now, Booker T. Washington benefited from the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and he and his family were freed. He was in Virginia. When he was freed at the age of 9 years old, he wanted to go to school so badly that he worked in the salt and coal mines of West Virginia at night so that he could begin his lessons during the day. And he would continue to work at night and take those lessons during the day, and those went on for several years until one night he heard these two older gentlemen in the mines talking about this place called Hampton Institute in Virginia, where people that were formerly enslaved could go and get an education. Now, Booker had no concept of what higher education was at that time, but what he was hearing from these two men, he thought Hampton literally must be heaven. And so he made up his mind that he was going to go to Hampton when he had enough money. And so at the age of 16 years old, with the help of his community, he would make a 500-mile walk to go to school. Now, that walk took a long time. He ran out of money on several occasions. He took odd jobs along the way. He slept outside. He slept in sewers. He slept under bridges. There was no challenge, no obstacle too great for him to overcome as a 16-year-old boy to go to school. And this is another great lesson and message for young people today, to hear that this boy, this teenage boy, walked 500 miles just to go to school. And so when he finally made it to Hampton after that long journey, he went straight to the headmistress of the school and he said, "I want to go to school here." And she looked at him. He was dirty. He was disheveled. His clothes were torn. And she said, "Young man, you are not worthy for admittance into this institution. Go on about your business." Well, Booker was not going to take no as an answer. He came back the next day, asked again. She shooed him away. He kept coming back and he kept coming back. And then finally, she had had enough. And she said, "Okay, Booker, you're driving me crazy here. I can see that you're not going to take no for an answer. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to prove yourself. There's a dirty classroom down the hallway. Why don't you go clean that and let's see what you can do." And so now he was able to put his skills to the test. He had learned the value of hard work, working in those salt and coal mines every night. And so he's cleaned and he cleaned. And then finally, she comes in to do the white glove test that I'm sure you're all familiar with. When I talk to the young kids, they don't know what the white glove test is, but she put on the white gloves and she's looking for dirt on the tables, the chairs, the window sills. Not only as she doesn't find any dirt, she doesn't find one speck of dust. And so she looked at young Booker and she said, "Okay, you have proven yourself and you are worthy for admittance into this institution. And not only that, we're going to give you the job as a janitor so you can work your way through college." He would go on to graduate 4 years later. He would come back to Hampton to teach. And in 1881, he got word that there was a group of people down in Tuskegee, Alabama, that had some money to start a school, an industrial school like Hampton, in the model of Hampton. And they were looking for a founder. They were looking for a principal. Word got back to that group that Booker T. Washington at Hampton was their man. And so Booker accepted the challenge and he rushed down to Tuskegee, excited to get started. And he looked around and he was looking for a church or an old schoolhouse somewhere where he could begin his lessons. But there was nothing but farmland and dirt as far as the eye could see. But he didn't get discouraged. He started recruiting students and he started getting them excited about getting an education. And then one of the first things that he taught them to do was to make bricks. He taught them to make bricks so that they could build their own school. And this is how badly those students, those formerly enslaved people, wanted to get an education, that they would stand out in the hot sun building their school brick by brick by brick. Now, Booker understood that education at Tuskegee you couldn't start trying to reach the higher aims in life until you could meet your basic needs in life. And so education at Tuskegee started with hygiene sometimes, teaching them how to brush their teeth, how to tie their shoes. And so you're talking about 4 million people that had been enslaved and oppressed for hundreds of years. Many didn't know how to read and write. There was no plan for emancipation. When these people were freed, many of them spent the first 2-3 years just trying to reconnect with family that they had been disconnected from. They didn't own property. There was no plan for emancipation. There was no counseling to deal with the trauma of enslavement. There was no post-traumatic stress disorder designation. And so these people were really trying to figure out a way on their own. And Booker T understood that the education needed to start with the basics, and start with an industrial education in the same way that he was trained at Hampton. So he would teach tools and skills like dressmaking and how to farm the land, how to become an entrepreneur. And what he was attempting to do was give these people a stake in the nation's growing economy, because Booker understood, coming out of enslavement, you had two questions. The first question was, yes, there were people that believed that slavery was morally wrong, But many of those same people didn't believe that Black people were equal to white people. So there was a second question of equality. And so rather than demanding that people just change their racist ideology, Booker T. Washington showed freed African Americans how they could change themselves, how they could overcome obstacles, develop strength of character, and rise by their own efforts to honorable positions of respect, but most importantly, self-esteem. So Washington was a leader who brought stability in a time of transition from enslavement to freedom. And it may be said that he's the person that bridged the gap between the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil Rights Movement. And so now I come into the picture. And I'm about 5 or 6 years old when I start to notice that my ancestors are on statues. They're on money, postage stamps. Schools, bridges are named for them, libraries are named for them. And I'm looking around and I started asking my classmates and my friends, are your grandparents on statues? And they would say no. And there was never a time when someone sat me down and said, Kenny, we have something really important to tell you about your family. I've just always known. I spent all of my summers in Frederick Douglass's summer beach house on the Chesapeake Bay, which was built for him by my great-great-grandfather, Charles, who was Frederick and Anna's youngest son. Charles built the home for his father as a retirement home. And in that house were images of my ancestors in every single room. And I remember one night at the top of the stairs, there was a larger than life portrait of Frederick Douglass, and he had this steely glare. Now, if you can imagine the photographs of him as a young Frederick Douglass, as an abolitionist, he was very strategic in the way that he went about presenting himself through photography. He said, I never want to look like a happy, amiable fugitive slave. And when you look at a photograph of me, you're never going to deny that I'm a man worthy of freedom and worthy of citizenship. He became the most photographed American of the 19th century. He was photographed more than President Lincoln, more than Ulysses S. Grant, more than General Custer, because he knew that he could use this technology, photography, that he'd become of age with to help make his arguments in addition to his oratory and to his writings. And so he's presenting himself in a way where he's shattering the notion in the public consciousness that people of African descent were not worthy of freedom. Perhaps they were better off in slavery. Listen to the songs that they sing. They're happy. They're getting the Christian religion, making a group of people an other to justify taking away their humanity, mistreating them, exploiting them. And so when I talk to young people about history, I want them to understand that history is not just about the past, but history is about the present. History is also about the future. And so when we consider rhetoric in today's times, making a group an other to justify mistreating them, they are rapists, they're criminals coming to our country, they're coming to invade and infest us. Same type of rhetoric and language that was used to justify people being enslaved in the United States for 400 years. And so this was really important for Frederick Douglass to also shatter the negative caricatures that were out there, the stereotype pictures and drawings of people with big eyes and big lips. And so Frederick Douglass was very strategic in the way that he went about presenting himself. So back to me in that larger than life portrait, he was looking with that steely, fiery glare. And I remember thinking as a little boy, man, you look mean. See, I didn't understand all of this most photographed American of the 19th century. I just thought, you look mean, and I'm glad I didn't know you. And as I would try and tiptoe or sneak past that portrait, you know what would happen? His eyes would follow me. And by the time I would get down to the end of the hallway, I could feel that steely glare burning like fire on the back of my neck. And I always imagined in my little boy imagination, this booming baritone voice bellowing down upon my tiny person. And he would say, "You will do great things, young man." And that's when I began to feel the weight of expectation. And I began to feel the pressure. And to be honest with you all, I spent most of my life running away from this legacy. I didn't want anything to do with it. And besides the few times that I told people of my relationship when I was younger, nobody ever believed me, including some teachers and a principal when I was in the 5th grade. And so imagine being a kid and people not believing you, and then also having the added weight of seeing what the pressure had done to those that came before me. I talked about my grandfather, Frederick Douglass III, who was a brilliant man. He was a surgeon. The reason that he was down at Tuskegee on that fateful day that he met my grandmother was because he had been commissioned down there by the Veterans Administration during World War II. He always walked around with this weight on his shoulders, and people expected him to be an iconic leader like his namesake. But there's only one Frederick Douglass. And when my grandmother was 3 months pregnant with my mom, that weight became too much for him to carry, and he took his own life. And so my mother was born without a father. She was raised without a father. And then when I came along with this dual lineage, my parents, grandparents, and great grandmothers went in the complete opposite direction, and they weren't going to force anything on me. And so I was really decisively disengaged from this lineage. I was a businessman. I owned my own advertising and marketing company. I was happy to be a father of 2 daughters and to be a husband, now married for 36 years. And don't even talk to me about any of this stuff. And all of that changed in 2005 when divine providence happened in my life. And that was, I read this National Geographic magazine with the cover story, 21st Century Slaves. And it was about human trafficking and modern day slavery existing all over the world, including right here in the United States. And when I read that article, I thought slavery had ended with the work of Douglass and the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. In my mind, I knew slavery was over. But I started to really research it. And I remember one night in particular, I was in my living room and I was reading an article, a separate article, about a 12-year-old girl who was forced to be a sex slave in the brothels of Southeast Asia and service countless men almost every single day. And while I'm reading this story, down the hallway, my daughters are getting ready for bed. And my older daughter, Jenna, was 12, so she's the same age as this girl that I was reading about. And my younger daughter, Nicole, was 9. And my mind just starts racing. And I'm thinking to myself, that's what young girls and boys should be doing, is getting tucked safely into their beds and not being forced into a bed to service some sick individual. And when I put the article down, I walked in to say goodnight to my daughters. And I had this moment where I couldn't look them in the eyes. I couldn't look them in the eyes and walk away and not do something about this. And it was almost immediately that everything started welling up inside of me. And I understood that I had this platform that my ancestors had built through struggle and through sacrifice. And perhaps I could leverage the historical significance of my ancestry to do something about this. And so we started looking at the landscape of anti-human trafficking and how it was being addressed. And it was being addressed from a reactionary standpoint. So after the crime had been committed, law enforcement comes in and they arrest and they prosecute the perpetrators. The victims are being rescued and restored and attempted rehabilitation after they've been victimized. So how can we use education? How can we unfit communities to allow slavery to exist and thrive through education? And we went back to that one story that I told you about Frederick Douglass, when his master said education will unfit him to be a slave. And so we combined the legacies of Frederick Douglass as the great abolitionist, Booker T. Washington as great educator, and we started our program, Abolition Through Education. And we turned immediately to schools, K through 12 schools, and we went in and we started talking about the history of slavery in this country. We would start to talk about contemporary forms of slavery and human trafficking, child labor trafficking, and age appropriate talking about child sex trafficking as a way to reduce the vulnerability of young people to being trafficked for sex and for labor. And then as we would talk about the history of slavery, contemporary slavery, ask the students to boil down, what are the basic elements? Well, the basic elements between history and contemporary forms of slavery, it's about profit, it's about money, it's about exploiting the most vulnerable amongst us. Then the question we would get is, now that we know about this, how can we be abolitionists? How can we be like a Frederick Douglass or Sojourner Truth or Harriet Tubman? And so we started to develop what we called then service learning curricula. It was called History, Human Rights, and the Power of One. Power of One being service and volunteer hours in the community. And now we found ourselves in schools all over the country through the service learning vehicle. That program has evolved into a program called Protect, Prevention Organized to Educate Children on Trafficking. We started in California. We partnered with the California Attorney General's Office, the California Department of Education 4 years ago, and developed this program, which is online training of educators on how to identify the red flags of trafficking in their classroom, in their schools, in their community, how to be able to intervene earlier before children are running away from home or dropping out of school. And then most importantly, these teachers get certification to be able to teach age-appropriate curriculum, prevention curricula in the classroom. And so in California, the training starts in elementary school, and it's about safe people, safe places, safe choices. It continues in middle school, high school, and then high school 2. We are in 30 plus counties in California now. We've started to expand into Utah, Nevada, and we're in San Antonio and Austin. And what we've developed is an online training module that will be able to scale up and hopefully become the model for the rest of the country. We've been able to work on federal legislation to make prevention education a priority. We've been able to get some money through legislation to do that. In California, we've been able to pass 3 bills that mandate human trafficking training education, once in middle school and once in high school. Our program goes much further than that, but at least we were able to get something done. So I'm really proud of the work that we've done around the legacies of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington. One of my favorite Frederick Douglass quotes is, "It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." And so if we're thinking about addressing any social ills, and we're seeing in this country right now, a divided country with hateful and sexist and racist rhetoric and people going to polar opposite sides of the political spectrum. And we've always hoped that Frederick Douglass's spirit, his spirit lives in all of us, and we believe that his spirit can be a unifying force. And while we haven't given up on repairing broken men and women, our focus and our mission is to build strong children and to end systems of exploitation and oppression. And we do that in classrooms every single day. We did a project, and I know my time is up here, and I just want to tell you about this project, which was in 2018. That was Frederick Douglass's bicentennial, which was the 200th anniversary of his birth. And we republished a special bicentennial edition of that narrative that I've been talking about. And we've been working to give away 1 million copies to students everywhere. We're a long way away from 1 million. And so we still need the help of people that would want to donate to the project. We've been able to get some grants. We've been able to work with some corporations that have sponsored books, and individuals have stepped up to allow us to be able to give this book to students everywhere. And we've given out thousands and thousands of copies in California, in Los Angeles, South Central Los Angeles, Pasadena. We were in a school in Pasadena back in 2018. And so I'm really proud of this book. We're working to build 1 million minds, 1 million abolitionists. Here are some photos of the students receiving books. This is at the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site in Washington, D.C. This is at a place called Home in South Central Los Angeles. This was at the Library of Congress when we launched the program. There's a Harriet Tubman in the making, a young Harriet Tubman. I love this story. This young man, his principal sent me this photograph, and he said, "I want you to know, this is what we do at my school when people are in detention. They read Frederick Douglass." And the student gave permission for me to talk about the story. And I thought, okay, I've got to meet this young man. And so we went to Los Angeles, and we gave away 550 books that day to his classmates. And I asked him, I said, so what did you do to earn detention? And he said, "Oh, I wasn't in detention. I just needed a quiet place to read." And so Frederick Douglass's story, which is a coming of age story, resonates with people of all ages, all races. And if you have not read his narrative, I encourage you to do so. It's a classic piece of literature that the Library of Congress named one of the 88 books that shaped America. It's remarkable to me that a man that never spent one day of his life in a classroom wrote a book that's still impacting people and that we're still talking about 175 years later. He wrote it at the age of 27 years old, only 7 years removed from slavery. And so this was in Newark, New Jersey. We gave away 650 books that day to an all-boys Catholic school. And it's been so beautiful to see how young people have responded. This is Malik. And he really is the reason for the idea behind this story. When we started Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives in 2007, in 2008, I started going into schools with a program called the Frederick Douglass Dialogues. And I was in this school in San Bernardino, and this was an assembly for 4th, 5th, and 6th graders. And I brought with me that day a first edition copy of Douglass's autobiography. And I just brought it, so I thought the students would get a kick out of seeing it. And my intention was just to put it on the table. They could walk by and just look at it and say, man, wow, that's a book. That's a 170-year-old book. But Malik raised his hand in the middle of my presentation, and he said, Mr. Morris, can I come up and can I read from that book? And I said, sure, come on up. And he said, okay, well, where should I start? And I said, no student has ever asked me to do this. Why don't you just start at the first chapter and just read the first paragraph? And so as you can see, he's standing up ramrod straight. He begins to read eloquently. He's pronouncing every word correctly, which if you've read Frederick Douglass is not an easy thing for adults to do. He's projecting to the back of the classroom. And when that photograph was taken, what I was thinking right then was, that's what Frederick Douglass must have looked like. And Malik wound up reading the whole first chapter. Now the chapters are not long. And he sat down to the applause of his classmates. I finished my presentation. And at the end, his teacher came up to me and said, I can't believe what Malik just did. And I said, I know, it was great, right? He said, no, you don't understand. I've had this kid in my class for 2 years, and he's never raised his hand once to even ask a question. But there was something in the stories that he heard that day that inspired him to get up in front of all of his classmates and to read so beautifully. Then 2 years later, I was at an NAACP event, a Freedom Fund event, and I was a keynote speaker. And there was a kid on the piano who was a virtuoso. He was an incredible piano player. I finished my presentation, and the young man came up to me and he said, do you remember me? And I said, no, I'm sorry, I don't. You look familiar. I'm embarrassed to say that I don't. And he said, my name is Malik. I read from the book. And of course, I had been telling the story. I had also given him a lapel pin that day. And I didn't notice until he pushed it out at me, but he was wearing that pin that I had given him a couple of years earlier. And his dad was with him, and his dad had never heard the story before. And so I told him the story, and he said, you know, something changed in my son around that time, and we didn't know what it was. We didn't even know that he had the talent to play the piano. And not only does he have the talent, he truly is a virtuoso. And Malik, last I heard, it's been a number of years since I've contacted him, he was giving piano lessons to underserved children in his community. And so he was giving back in his own way. What we want young people to do is use their passion, their talent, their intellect, their creativity to address those social issues that are most important to them. You know, there are young people that are concerned about the environment. There are young people that want to eradicate homelessness and poverty. There are young people that want to fight for the rights of women and girls and enact gun safety legislation. Whatever it is, just like Frederick Douglass, use your voice, your pen. Well, I guess in the case of young people, it's your keyboard, because the pen really becomes a metaphor these days. And then eventually, when you're old enough, use your vote. And so we're in a really important election year this year. And of course, we want to inspire all of young people that are of voting age to get out and to vote and to really get into the community and use their voices. Booker T. Washington said, if you want to lift up yourself, lift up someone else. And what we've been able to see through the education that we deliver are young people that are starting to think critically about their lives, thinking critically about their communities, thinking critically about institutions where racism runs systemically throughout American life, thinking critically in the same way that Frederick Douglass did when he started to teach himself to read and write. He would ask questions like, why am I a slave? Why do you own me? And how come you know your birthday and I don't know my birthday? And then he would turn to God and he would pray to God for deliverance from his chains and his bondage. And he would say, God, I don't understand how my master puts on a suit every Sunday, goes to church, and in the word, in cherry-picked scripture and verses, finds justification to brutalize, dehumanize, rape, pillage, and plunder his property. As a young boy, he's starting to make the differentiation between what he would later call in life the slave-holding Christianity of the land versus the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ. So now we're seeing young people saying, well, why am I born into a certain zip code and I have less opportunity, I have less access to good education and healthcare, economic opportunity through no fault of my own versus somebody that's born into another zip code who has all the advantages in the world? And so we want young people thinking critically, and our programs have been able to do that. I'm going to close here. I know I've gone a little bit long. History lives in each of us. History doesn't just live in me because I descend from two people that we've heard of, but history lives in each and every one of the young people that we come into contact with. History lives in each and every one of you. We all descend from somebody that made a difference, somebody that may have sacrificed their lives for the freedoms. I may be talking to some of you that have sacrificed your lives for the freedoms that we enjoy in this country, may have sacrificed for the right for some of us to even be able to sit in a classroom and get an education today. We stand on the shoulders of those that came before us, and we walk in the shoes of those that came before us. And I think history is important for a lot of reasons, but I think it's most important because we need to know where we come from in order to know where we're headed. And our young people today do not know where they come from, but it's not their fault. But what we found is that when they hear the stories of their ancestors, and for those of us of color that have been placed in an inferior position in history by the whitewashing and sanitized version of history that we've been given since the founding of this country, then young people, when they hear their stories and they know that they descend from Black pioneers that forged ways into the new frontier, and they descend from people that were innovative and that they designed and they created, they used their intellect. We see them sitting up straighter in their chairs. I had a 10-year-old girl say to me one time, she was so excited to share this with me. She said, Mr. Morris, I researched my family tree and I found that my great, four greats grandmother, imagine trying to say that. I thought I had it hard with 3 greats. She said, my great grandmother was born into slavery. She taught herself to read and write in secret. And then she escaped and she became a successful businesswoman and a philanthropist. And she knew exactly what that word meant and she was proud of it. And so she said, so Mr. Morris, do you know what all of this means? And before I had a chance to respond, she said, it means I have greatness flowing through my veins, just like you do. And I will never forget that. All of us have greatness flowing through our veins. History lives in each of us, but the future depends on how we carry that forth. I thank you all very much for listening to my story. It's been my honor and my privilege to be able to share with you this afternoon. I hope once we get through this pandemic and we can see each other in person again, I'll have an opportunity to come out and maybe talk to you in the future in person and share more stories with you, share more progress about our organization and more impact on how we are really building strong children. Thank you.
Is that a promise?
That's a promise, and it's been recorded. So
okay, all right. Well, I'm so moved. I'm sure we all are. And if you have time for questions, I can't imagine there aren't going to be questions.
I do have time, so yes.
So, thank you. And everybody, when you speak, raise your hand in front of your face, and we'll try and invite you to speak. But be sure and unmute yourself when you speak. Nan, you have to unmute yourself.
Maybe the moderator can unmute her.
You work on it.
I might be able to do that since I have.
I think she got it.
Yeah, there she is.
Thank you. I just want to say, this was so inspiring for us all, and what a wonderful history you have, and for giving us all this inspiration. I hope you'll be willing to let us all know about the different organizations that you are involved with and how we can get in touch with them, because some of them are exactly some of the things that many of us are interested in doing. And I have to say, I'm awfully glad that you didn't get to run away when that day that you thought you would from all of this history and everything. Instead, you were able to be here with us today to our great gratification. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Nan. And I think
the
I
apple
think
doesn't fall far from the tree.
Thank
It
you.
just takes time.
It takes time, and I think because I found this mission on my own, it's more meaningful than had it been forced on me. But we'll have to get copies of the book to you. In the back of the book that I talked about are all of the organizations that we're affiliated with. And then I put the website up. Please visit our website, which is fdfi.org.
And I know we'd like a book for our Villa Gardens library.
We'll make sure to get one out to you.
Thank you. Question, Moulton.
You mean Joe Fulton?
Fulton, I'm sorry. Yeah.
That's all right. I've recorded this on my cell phone, and I wonder if I can share this with other people, Mr. Morris, if you would allow that.
Yeah, I would think that would be fine. You might want to actually share the actual recording that was made of this presentation, because I think the quality will probably be a little bit better and easier to share.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't have a full screen
Brenda.
to see who's
Yes,
raising their hand. Johnny.
Brenda.
Okay, Brenda.
Yeah, well, actually, is related to that. Where do we find the proper recordings so we can share from there?
That would probably be a question for Donine, I imagine.
Yes.
Donnie?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Villagardens.org. And
Okay.
on that website, there's a tab that says culture,
Okay.
ULTURE. Go to the very bottom and you'll see all 5 of the speakers. Usually takes 2 to 3 days.
Okay.
But you'll see the link. Like all 5 are listed now, but obviously this one's not on there. So yes, everybody's welcome to do that.
And thank you for sharing that with us about our work. Appreciate it.
It's great. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm not seeing anybody else, Jean.
No, I'm not either. I think
Alice.
you're overwhelmed.
Alice Yee, did you have a question? Oh, you have to unmute. I'm trying.
Well,
Alice Yee, can you unmute yourself? Our computer isn't allowing us to do that. I apologize. No. Oh, what the heck? I'm trying.
There.
Am I unmuted?
Now you're unmuted. Thank you.
No, I'm sitting here thoroughly processing, shall we say, what has been said and how deeply moving I find it. What do I say? I don't have any questions. I really would like to have the name of the group, the institution that you're working with. I'd like to have written material to share with other people. And so I'll work at that.
Yeah, and I really encourage you to go to our website if that's something that you do navigate the internet.
And what is your website, Ken?
It's fdfi.org, and that's the acronym for Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. So fdfi.org.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Thanks, Alice. Nan?
We'll do that.
And is that that will lead you, that FIDI will lead you to the whole range of.
Yeah, let me since I'm able to share here, let me see if I can show you. That would probably be the best way.
That would be a good idea, yeah.
Yeah. So here's the website, And at the top, you can learn more about us, the family lineage, about our board of directors, the co-founders,
That's great.
our
That's
initiatives, and then the Protect program that I talked about, which is the human trafficking program. You get information there, and then it'll take you to, if you click there, you can go to that website, which will give you all the information that you need. And then the book project was called was 1 Million Abolitionists, and that'll take you to information on the book project. And we also have a project website for that as well.
That's very helpful. I'm sure many people will be interested in that. And the sex trafficking is something that I've been in touch with a couple of the organizations here that are working on that. My own family, and it's as you put out so well, it's a worldwide problem.
Yeah, it is. There are millions of people that are enslaved around the world, men, women, and children, and half of those enslaved, and it said estimates up over 40 million people enslaved, and half of those people are children. And they're children that are laboring in the hot sun making bricks. They're children that are in Africa on Lake Volta farming the fish that we eat. You know, slavery is really in just about every product that we use and consume every single day. And we in the United States as consumers, we demand that our products are cheaper, bigger and cheaper. So we want to go buy a 100-inch TV, but we want to pay as little for that as possible. And in order for that to happen, somewhere down the supply chain, because of globalization, there are people that are enslaved that are producing these products for us. And so we have to be mindful, you know, as Americans and as caring people, caring about human rights, that we have to demand that companies have policies in place to clean up their supply chains.
And have living wages.
And living wages, exactly. So there's a lot to all of it. Our focus, again, is just on the prevention education side and not the restoration or rescuing of victims. There are organizations out there that are doing that very important work. But we feel like if we can reduce the vulnerability of a young person being trafficked in the first place, then you're not going to have the need for such costly restoration.
Right.
It's costly to a community, and it's also costly to that child that was traumatized. Who knows if they can ever get back to some semblance of wholeness.
And there's no specific profile for a child or a young person to be trafficked. Very bright, intelligent young people are caught in this horrible trap.
Yeah, well, all of us have vulnerabilities that somebody can exploit if they know the right vulnerability to exploit. And we see that with the elderly, people trying to, you know, get into your pocketbook. I was almost the victim of an exploitation several years ago because I do public speaking, and I got an email from South Africa. And we do partner with the Desmond Tutu campaign in South Africa. So we already do work with them. And I got this email about coming to South Africa and speaking in this stadium, and that you would get paid X amount of dollars. It would go to your work. And it came from somebody that I Google searched that was a prominent person in South Africa. Well, as it turns out, I responded to that email and said, yes, I'd like to get more information. And then the next email came, and they said, okay, we need to be able to send you a deposit for your speaking fee. We need your bank information. And so that, of course, clicked in. And then I went back to the first email and looked at it. And that first email was so full of typos and all of these things that I should have recognized. But because I was so zeroed in, they knew my vulnerability, and that was to be able to speak to people about our work. And I missed all of that stuff. So here I am teaching young people, helping them not be so vulnerable. And then I find out that here I am as an adult man. So we all have vulnerabilities, but especially young people, where they're still, you know, forming their identity and their character and who they're going to become. And then the other key to this is that perpetrators and traffickers will zero in on young people that have some sort of issues at home. So if they're coming from some sort of abuse at home, or they're not getting love at home, and that could be, you know, kids that are coming from well-to-do families where their parents are not there because they're working long hours every single day, that kid can be vulnerable as well. And so that's why education is so important.
And education is, because today we see so much of exactly what you're talking about, the emphasis on division and on fear and the problems resulting from that. And that's what we're all having to try to combat today. And that's education is the problem, is the answer to that.
Yeah, and then being able to parse through that education too, because there's so much available online that anybody could write and say anything,
Yes.
whether it's truthful or not. So we have to be able to navigate that. Sally, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just wondered how you felt when you heard the president wish Ghislaine Maxwell well, and the message that sent to everyone listening.
Yeah, well, it's tragic because, you know, and she's still accused at this point. She hasn't been prosecuted, but the evidence seems to be there of the exploitation with Epstein of who knows how many young girls, underage girls. And we need our leaders on both sides of the aisle to be able to speak the truth, and then also to be able to, you know, guide the country and lead the country. And when you're talking about somebody that's been accused as a child predator and child exploiter and trafficker, you know, we need our leaders to do better in their messaging.
Can you see the chat group?
Yes.
Okay, because there are some specific questions. Someone in the audience had their 6-year-old at home with them. What an amazing experience
Oh,
for a
thank you very much.
6-year-old. I've lost the whole screen, so I'm working.
You're on the whole screen. Yeah.
It looks like there's some thank yous in here. Thanks to all of you.
Right.
I appreciate you listening, and I never get tired of hearing those words. Thank you. So,
Well,
No one does. No.
great presentation. Oh, okay. I represent the National Council of Negro Women and would like
there,
to.
that's what I was wondering.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah, well, I'd be happy to give you my email address. Let me put it in the chat.
Okay. Annette, can you get to chat?
Annette, are you around?
Annette Spencer?
Can you hear me?
And Spence, yeah, can you get to chat and get his
I'm
email?
watching it right now. As soon as he puts it in, I can write it down.
Great.
Yeah, I just did. And hi, Judy. Good to see you. Judy Matthews.
Yes, hi.
Hi, Judy. Good.
Judy. Hi, Judy.
Yeah.
Judy said, I believe there may be a relation on my father's side. We'll contact you. Okay, I look forward to hearing that. So you're telling me that we might be family?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay.
Look
All right.
Imagine that.
Imagine that.
Well,
Let's see.
I'm not sure how to sign off. It just seems, but
Annette, did we get your question?
Yes.
Okay. Well, how do we thank Ken Morris? And Lynn Tewitt is on this call. Martha Zavala is on this call, who spoke before. Thank you, Ken. This was amazing.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure to be able to share with you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
And I see Cynthia knows how to use the hand clap feature. That's impressive. Okay, thank you. If there's no other questions, then I will go ahead and sign off, and I wish you all a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
And that was a promise. I will come and visit you at some point.
Thank you.
All right, we will hold you to it.
Okay, sounds
Thank
great.
you.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Nan.
you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Nan. Thanks, Jean.